We're looking at the classical theory of international trade, and this is due to David Ricardo. Before we get too far into our theory building, I want to emphasize the importance of the construction materials used to build any theory. And in particular, it is key that you study the assumptions to see which ones are necessary and which ones are superficial. One of the things that you will take away from this type of analysis is that the strength of the assumptions explain the robustness of the theory. So sometimes a theory is built and the assumptions are rather strong assumptions, and sometimes you can use weaker assumptions and get pretty much the same outcome. You might decide to use inferior materials, or you might decide to use very solid materials. The stronger the materials, the longer the house lasts. Therefore, if you think of the assumptions you're making, you want to ask, do I need to make these assumptions, and are the assumptions too rigid or too strong? If you put strong assumptions in and you relax the assumptions and you find that the theory is still well explained, then you know you have a good theory. So take a look in your textbook and you'll see the assumptions that you should have gone through by now to get to the end of chapter 3. The assumptions of the basic model. Assumption number 1, all economic agents exhibit rational behavior. You should spend a lot of time thinking about rationality. I say that if economics were a religion, rationality would be the god of the religion. You want to understand what rationality means and how it explains human behavior, or how it is assumed to explain human behavior. What I would say is that assuming rationality allows us then to move forward in constructing a theory that might not need a strong rationality. We could then relax rationality to include not irrationality, but a lower degree of rationality. The theory starts out by assuming 2 countries, 2 goods, and 1 factor of production. In chapter 4 we will add a second factor of production. In chapter 5 we will generalize the theory beyond this, but 2 goods, 2 countries, 1 factor of production, and that factor of production is labor. Assumption number 3 is no money illusion. This means that if you had twice as much cash and prices were twice as high, you're not deluded into thinking that you have more money. Your purchasing power is exactly the same if everything doubles. All the nominal variables, the prices and the quantity of money, were to double. That is the idea of no money illusion. Assumption number 4 assumes that the factor endowments in each country are fixed. It also assumes that the set of technologies for producing the 2 goods are fixed. So we have fixed input-output ratios in both sectors, and we have a fixed quantity of labor, and that helps us to define the production possibilities frontier. Effectively, we have a 5-variable equation. We make 3 of the variables constants, and then we're down to effectively a straight line. 2 variables in 1 equation, and it's a linear equation, so effectively our production possibility frontier in the Ricardian analysis will be a straight line. This comes out of also assuming constant returns to scale in production, so that if you double the amount of inputs you have, in this case the amount of labor, you will get double the amount of output. So constant returns to scale is effectively the equation for a straight line, output against inputs, and with a constant slope. To keep things simple, we are going to assume perfect competition in both sectors. This means that all of the income belongs to the factor of production, in this case labor. So the entire income comes from labor, and all of the returns from production go back to labor. We could change this to a more realistic assumption at a later point, including capital or land or entrepreneurial talent, but for now we're going to make the assumption that there's perfect competition, there's only 1 wage rate, the competitive wage rate, and all workers are paid at that level, and we assume 1 factor of production. So this oversimplifies the model, but it's a nice place to start. Moving on, factors of production. We assume that factors of production are equally efficient in both sectors and are freely mobile between sectors. So I could be a computer designer today, and tomorrow I can be an agricultural worker. Without any experience as an agricultural worker, I am just as productive as every other agricultural worker, and vice versa. An agricultural worker can come to the computer sector and be just as efficient in production as another computer worker who was there before. Free mobility of resources between the two sectors and efficiently producing resources so that we're always on the production function rather than inside the production function, and effectively we'll always be on the production possibilities frontier. Once we sketch that or define that, we'll always be producing efficiently, and as resources move from one sector to the other, nothing changes in terms of the degree of productivity or the average degree of productivity. All workers are equally adept at all production processes. On the consumption side, we're going to assume that there are community indifference curves. Everyone has the same preference in the country, so we can draw one indifference curve to represent the average satisfaction level derived from consuming these two goods. And everyone being identical means that a single indifference curve will represent everyone in the economy. Rather than some individuals liking one good and others liking the other, we're going to assume that all individuals like the same goods in exactly the same way. Now let us think about the second country. The first key assumption we're going to make is that resources cannot move from one country to the other. There's mobility between sectors within a country, but there's no international mobility of factors of production. In this case, no international mobility of labor. Later we will see that we don't need that strong of an assumption, but as a starting point, we're going to keep things simple and assume that goods can move between countries, but resources cannot. We're also going to assume that there are no barriers or restrictions to trade, so there's free international trade in goods. There are no taxes or tariffs to prevent goods from entering a given country, and there's no opposition to goods being foreign and not being liked. We're going to assume that the goods are homogeneous across countries. In other words, generic products. That would be the simplest way to handle this assumption. All the products are identical, so it doesn't matter where the product is produced. You cannot really distinguish a difference because of the nature of the product. I think we've touched on all of the assumptions. Constant returns to scale, balanced trade, exports equal imports, and there is no trade surplus or trade deficit. So you consume based on the income that you make, and everything is spent, everything is produced and consumed, and the only factor in this model right now is who gets to consume. We're going to assume that because the countries, while they have fixed input-output ratios, they're differently endowed and differently capable, but all the workers in a given country are equally capable, so we might have a more productive environment in one country versus the other country. If you think of climate conditions, that might help. There's some products that grow better in tropical climates. They don't thrive in temperate climates, and vice versa. So we're saying there are different factor productivities in the different countries, but the product is going to be the same product at the end of the day. So think of sugar. Doesn't matter where it's produced, at the end of the day, the scientific process it goes through produces sugar. So that is the fundamental idea in the Ricardian analysis, and hopefully we can move forward with this to solve the problems that we have to work on. Okay?